If we could pivot into another topic you've done beautiful, excellent work on, the logos. And I know I'm not going to try to define this, or I know that's an infinite rabbit hole, but just this idea of the word effectively being the medium of exchange of human intention, right? When we're communicating, I use words to communicate an idea to you. I'm intending to propagate a message to you.
Yeah, you probably use words to communicate value, which ties it more tightly to what we've been talking about.
Yeah, and then I would map that also to money is something, a medium of exchange of human action, right? This is something that's actually been done in the world, capital created, value created or not created, right? Your profit and loss is telling you, are your actions benefiting society? Are you profitable, as we talked about earlier? Or are you generating a loss, meaning that it's not valuable enough to people based on the economic inputs into the product or service? So, totalitarianism, another topic you've done a lot of great work on, they always attack freedom of speech, right?
It's unnecessary.
Freedom of speech is not necessary inside.
Not if you're a totalitarian.
Right, because you know everything.
You already know everything.
You know everything.
You don't need any new ideas. Get the hell away from me with those.
And so there's countless examples of totalitarians attacking the freedom of speech. Indeed, it's one of the first things they do, right?
Yeah,
they try to take over the media.
It's almost an unerring hallmark of the totalitarian mind.
And the other unerring hallmark is the central bank. So Marx's 1848 Manifesto of the Communist Party, measure number 5, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly.
Yeah, that sounds like Marx.
So my question is, okay, words...
Jesus, what a dismal sentence that is.
So we have words...
How many people died because of that sentence? Like tens of millions of people.
Over 100 million, right?
That sentence.
So,
Jesus.
The word is a medium of exchange for intention, money is a medium of exchange for action. If totalitarianism necessitates the corruption and control of the words and money, can't we at least limit the threat of totalitarianism by using a technology that makes our money incorruptible?
Well, that's the idea.
And by extension, this goes a little bit deeper on Bitcoin, but in theory, and there's projects out there, that you can build communication protocols on top of Bitcoin that make your communications unstoppable. So we could have true freedom of speech in the digital space.
Yeah.
Isn't that a bulwark against totalitarianism?
Look. Yes, I would say so. And you run into the free rider problem, head on, and that's a big problem because we talked a little bit about this earlier, that there are exploitative types, the psychopathic types, and they're about 3% of the population cross-culturally. And it isn't obvious how you control them in a system like the one that you're describing.
Free market system?
Yeah.
I think you could still have prisons, police, all of those things, but it's just not systemized on, the property right violations aren't systemized via inflation and these things.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's a worthy experiment and doesn't seem to have any self-evident psychological or logical flaws. When we've been building an argument from first principles here to some degree, we could talk about the logos again and about the proclivity of totalitarians to squelch free speech. It could be that our communication is always about value, right? Because what else would you communicate about? I mean, what do you want to know from someone? You want to know what they value. That might be all you want to know about them. Is that an overstatement? Probably not.
I think action's an expression of value, and ultimately we're talking about acting in the world. Yeah. So I don't
right. Well, that's it. That's right. And I mean, certainly advertisers pay for your attention. They're paying for the process by which they're paying to engage themselves in the process by which you determine value. And so language is a medium for the exchange of information about value, we could say. And so is money any different than that? And the answer to that could well be No, they might be the same thing. And so is Bitcoin an incorruptible language? Probably not, because that would be a hell of a thing if it was true, right? I mean, so it strikes me as unlikely that we've managed that. But it isn't obvious to see where there's a flaw in that.
Well, you know what's different, I think, between words and money, let's say, is that words are low-cost signal. You can say a lot of words, you can mislead people and all of this, but money tends to be a costly signal.
True.
If you put your skin in the game, you put capital in at risk, right, to do something. That's a much more, what would we say,
credible,
high-cost signal. So,
yeah, well,
yes.
I think part of the problem with social media platforms is that the cost of words is zero.
Right. Yes.
And that's the wrong cost.
Yes.
Partly because people, the psychopath types in particular, are terrible on social media platforms because they can say and do things that would get them thrashed if they were doing them
Yes.
in the real world, and there's no cost.
We have, I mean, there's a lot of experiments in the space. I've got a friend here running a company called Zion, and they are aiming to fix that, actually. It's just add a cost to communication in digital space, and you flush all that out. You increase the quality of discourse in digital reality just by making it non-zero, as you're describing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'd love to say this to you. We think Bitcoin fixes that, Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, well, that would be
It's early, but it's promising at least, so.
Yeah, do you have any sense of why people would move to platforms where communication was, maybe because the psychopaths would be there?
It's a complicated question to break the network effects of something like Twitter
Right.
and whatnot, but there are financial incentives to own your own data too, because right now your attention's being sold on these networks. You keep, like, you're not paid for being on Twitter. I mean, maybe you are, but most
No.
people aren't. In this world of owning your own data, like a decentralized, Bitcoinized Twitter, you would, in theory, be able to selectively monetize your attention.
Right.
So that incentive could break the network effect of something like Twitter.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, we don't want to build social communication networks that aren't viable, that aren't valid analogs of our real world communication networks. You know, and I've been thinking this through psychologically, I suppose, for the last couple of months. What happens if you have a widespread communication system that doesn't abide by the same incentive structures that real world communication abides by? And I think Twitter is a good example of that, primarily because the cost of being provocative
in real life
is zero. And so that's an externalized cost. You know, we have these ideas about the market not being a comprehensive indicator of value. There's externalized costs, pollution, for example, market failure. Well, Twitter externalizes its pollution because it isn't an analog of real world communication systems. It introduces insanity into the communication structure, because I think technically a communication system that doesn't abide by the rules of real world communication systems is insane. That's the definition of it. Yeah, there's a parasitical element for sure. And so getting the incentives right, this is a crucial issue, right? And of course that's why we're talking about all of this, is that the cost of communication in a virtual world has to be analogous to the cost of communication in the real world,
right,
or the system is insane.
Right.
I think that might be true.
Right.
So
there's a cost of being a schmuck in the real world, but not so much on Twitter, and that's
right. There's a
incoherent.
real,
Yeah.
people say things on Twitter all the time that they would never say once in their life, because
Right.
if they ever said them, someone would kill them. So,
Completely
it would
agree.
come to blows immediately.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I would plug one series I did actually with Michael Saylor. He goes in depth how he thinks Bitcoin could fix this, and it's a longer discussion, but
Yeah,
I would
no
plug
doubt.
that here. Can we talk about time? So, as your work brilliantly points out, the fall of man was effectively the discovery of time, which was also the realization that we must work. Right? And for all these reasons we're describing, we're always vulnerable. We must always prepare for the future. And through work, we're effectively sacrificing the present to the future, right? That's delayed gratification, that's capital accumulation, that's the ethic of capitalism. But debt is the exact opposite, right? We're sacrificing the future to the present. We're accelerating gratification, engaging in dis-saving, and it's effectively the opposite of work, right? To take on debt and buy something instead of working and saving for it. So another framing for fiat currency that I think is useful is that it is a debt-based money. So as you were describing earlier, inflation destroys savers, right? It destroys prudence, and it actually incentivizes its opposite. I am incentivized to accumulate as much debt as possible, knowing that inflation will erode that real debt burden over time.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a moral hazard there, especially for governments.
And I think, so the Austrians would say that this is raising your time preference, which is to say makes you think shorter term.
Yeah.
And that concept of time preference is inexorably related to the moral standard. So the Austrians have actually written the monetary standard and the moral standard are inexorably linked. If you're debasing the currency, you're inducing immorality, like gambling, debt accumulation, short-sightedness, all of these things.
Yeah,
so
that seems right.
So as we said earlier, it's decivilizing in more ways than one. So my question would be, if we're going to construct a sustainable civilization, one that's going to stand the test of time, shouldn't we aim to remove the avenues of wealth acquisition that involve, I'll say taking, which would be inflation, taxation, theft, rent seeking?
It's interesting, because one of the things that's happening now with the rise of these ESGs, there are all sorts of people who are hypothetically concerned that our time horizon isn't long enough and we're burning the planet at our own expense, right? We're destroying the planet for future generations, I suppose, assuming they care about future generations, which I generally doubt. But in any case, that's our moral crime, and it's associated with a kind of an impulsive hedonism. And so the cure for that appears to be more central planning. And I think that's a really bad idea, because if the market system is a computational mechanism that allows us to value the transforming horizon of the future, then imposing a fiat solution on that interferes with our ability to adapt. And so you might think, well, no, because my solution is correct. It's like, well, even if you're right, which you aren't, but even if you were, right for how long? Like 2 weeks, a month, things change, man. You think your solution is right forever? And so now we've got this situation where corporations are increasingly being judged on their sustainability. It's like, try computing sustainability. This is the time preference problem, right? I mean, it's not possible. It's actually not possible. Partly because as you compute out into the future, your error margins grow until, what are you going to plan 60 years down the road? How the hell can you do that? No one envisioned the world we're in 60 years ago. I mean, I read science fiction when I was a kid 40 years ago. Everyone was in rockets traveling from planet to planet, but nobody had a home-based computer or computing device that was more powerful than the entire Apollo program in the palm of their hand. So we just got that 100% wrong. And so we don't know how to, by fiat, determine sustainability. And I think we're going to make a bloody mess of things trying to do that. Your point would be, well, the proper way to incentivize sustainability would be to produce an incorruptible store of value. And so, hey, it's a good theory.
And in addition to that, giving people an option for a property right that cannot be preyed upon by the state, right? So we know in every business, like if you go to buy a car and you can't come to terms with a guy, you can always walk out of the door, right? You can always go to his competitor, and that effectively keeps him honest. Whereas if he's the monopolist, he's the only guy on the block, then he'll charge you whatever he wants. He doesn't care about your preferences. We haven't had this exit option in money, ever. You could bury gold in your backyard. That's not very practical. Hard to lug it around, et cetera, et cetera. So Bitcoin's kind of this like honesty forcing function on state behavior. And that if they're excessively oppressive or excessive regulation, taxation, whatever it is, people can exit into this property right that's independent of the state.
Yeah, well, I've read already, and I'm no economist and I'm certainly no Bitcoin expert, but I've read already that countries that attempted to clamp down hard on Bitcoin saw a depreciation in their own currency's value on currency trading markets because the market read that as insufficient faith in the validity of their own currency.
Right.
And that's pretty damn interesting. I think it's true. So even if Bitcoin becomes nothing other than that kind of corrective, that wouldn't be nothing. That would be quite something. So I don't see any logical flaws in that formulation. I mean, Robert and I were talking about this a little bit backstage. I don't want to preempt the discussion, but I'm as a trained social scientist and a pessimistic one in some sense. I'm always looking for the unexpected consequence. That's also what makes me somewhat conservative, I would say, in my political leanings. Bitcoin is a radical social experiment, and do you worry, Bitcoiners in general, do you worry that by replacing a fiat currency, or the fiat currency, or any fiat currency maybe, ultimately, are we going to destabilize things that fiat currencies are doing that we don't understand? Like how much utility is there? Is there utility in allowing your government, assuming it's regulated by vote and it's a free society, is there utility in allowing the government to make fundamental financial decisions that Bitcoin would threaten, in a negative way? And like I said, I'm not an economist, and I know there are arguments about why that won't be the case, but arguments and reality aren't the same thing.
As I said to you backstage, and quoting you actually, there is stability in the hierarchy, even if that hierarchy is somewhat tyrannical. So this is a massive change, right? If this is actually the disruption of gold, well, the whole world's built on top of gold right now. Central banking's built on top of gold. Nation states are built on top of the central bank. So there could be a period of instability, let's say. Very hard to say where it goes. But this idea of removing coercion from the socioeconomic fabric, it increases wealth, increases human happiness, increases psychological stability in the long run, right?
That's the problem, right? That's the problem, right?
Right.
It's the time preference problem.
Yes.
And it's always, this is also the problem with the apocalyptic doomsaying of the environmentalists. It's like, well, you were wrong. Well, we're out by 30 years.
Right. And they can always say that.
Well, that's right. They can always say that.
And the Fed does this too. Every time there's an economic disaster and they intervene, they say, well, it would have been worse had we not intervened.
Right, exactly.
It's unfalsifiable, right?
Yes. Well, this is also partly why we fall prey so frequently to apocalyptic thinking. And it might be a fatal flaw in our cognitive mechanism. It's like, well, prove the apocalypse isn't going to happen. Sorry. There are runaway processes, and they emerge unpredictably, and so the climate catastrophists could, in principle, be right. My problem with that is, well, there's an indefinite number of apocalyptic catastrophes, and so what are we going to do? Pay attention to every single one of them at the same time? Like, why should your apocalyptic catastrophe take precedence? Yeah. And the answer to that generally is because I think I'm right. It's like, well, that's just not good enough. And so back to the Bitcoin issue. Would we produce a more sustainable society if we had a less corruptible store of long-term value? I can't see how we couldn't. Right. We'd extend our time frame out to some degree, right? Because now the currency is unstable. Right. And that's factored into all the economic decisions that we make. Yeah. And if we stabilize the currency so it didn't vary as much over the time frames that we can compute, I suspect that would make us more future-oriented.
Yeah, you're incentivizing prudence, right? The opposite of inflation.
Yeah.
And reward those that are competent, move us away from a dominance hierarchy to a competence hierarchy.
That'd be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for those of us who believe that such things exist.